The pastry war sounds ridiculous, but the real story is much darker. France did not fight Mexico over dessert, it fought over money, pride, trade, and the belief that a young republic could be punished from the sea. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Before the cannon spoke, there was a little pastry shop, not a palace, not a battlefield, not a throne room where kings sharpen maps with their fingers, just a shop in Tacubaya near Mexico City where a Frenchman tried to make a living selling sweets in a country still tasting blood. And before this story ends, warships will choke the Gulf, a fortress will crack, and a Mexican general will bury his own leg like a saint. The question is so strange that it sounds fake. Did France really go to war with Mexico over pastries? That is what the name wants you to believe, the Pastry War. It sounds like a joke, like history got drunk and wrote a headline with frosting on its hands, but the name is a mask. Behind it were debts, tariffs, wounded pride, broken treaties, foreign merchants, a starving treasury, and the old habit of powerful nations turning complaints into cannons. This happened between 1838 and 1839 during the second presidency of Anastasio Bustamante, when Mexico was still a young republic trying to stand on its own after independence. The country had become independent in 1821, but independence did not arrive like a clean dawn. It came with empty coffers, angry generals, regions distrusting the capital, soldiers who expected pay, and politicians who often needed a miracle just to survive the week. Now zoom out across the ocean. France was ruled by King Louis Philippe, a king with a merchant's soul and a government that looked at Latin America like a table set after a feast. The old Spanish Empire had cracked. New republics were born, and in Paris, business people imagined those republics buying French cloth, wine, tools, perfumes, and all the polished luxuries France knew how to sell. To them, Mexico was not only a country, it was a market waiting to open. But Mexico was not an open door. It was a wounded house with guards at every entrance. The French merchants who settled there were not all grand tycoons with gold rings and marble offices. Many were small men of the city, bakers, artisans, shopkeepers, tailors, retailers. They lived behind counters beneath rented roofs, always listening for the next riot, the next unpaid regiment, the next order from some ministry that needed money yesterday. And that is where our little pastry shop enters. The owner is often remembered as Monsieur Remontel, a French pastry cook in Tacubaya. The story says Mexican officers damaged or looted his restaurant during the years of unrest, and his claim became one thread in a much larger bundle of French complaints. Some versions make the pastries the whole cause. That is the easy version, the tempting version. But history, like the sea, keeps deeper currents beneath the surface. Remontel's complaint mattered because it was useful. It was small enough to mock, vivid enough to remember, and perfect for a nickname. Mexicans could point to it and say, look, France has crossed the ocean because someone lost a cake. France becomes ridiculous. France becomes a bully in an apron. But the French government was not truly mobilizing ships over a tray of sweets. It was gathering years of grievances and giving them one absurd, unforgettable face. French residents claimed they had been hurt by civil disorder, forced loans, arbitrary demands, and the threat that foreigners might be pushed out of retail trade. That last point matters. Wait, notice this. For a colony made largely of shopkeepers and artisans, the right to sell directly was not a legal detail. It was bread, it was rented, it was survival. Remove retail trade, and the French colony in Mexico would not simply suffer, it would wither. France had also failed to secure a durable commercial treaty. Negotiations came and went like bad weather. In 1827, a provisional arrangement pointed toward better relations. Still, the trouble returned around the same old questions: forced loans, protections for French subjects, and whether foreign merchants could be shielded from restrictions. The French wanted guarantees. Mexico wanted sovereignty. Both wanted money. Neither had enough patience. Now stand in Mexico's place for a moment. The country was not refusing France a throne of comfort. Mexico's treasury was nearly always hungry. Customs duties were the blood in the veins of the state. Veracruz was not just a port. It was the throat of the treasury. Goods came through, taxes were collected, and with that money the government tried to pay soldiers, officials, and the fragile machinery that kept the republic from falling apart. So when France complained about high tariffs, Mexico heard something different. It heard a foreign power asking the country to cut its own lifeline. When France complained about forced loans, Mexico saw merchants with goods, credit, and connections. At the same time, the government itself was desperate for cash. None of this made the policies any gentler or fairer. It simply shows the trap. Mexico was weak, and weakness often makes a government grab at whatever can still be grabbed. The French government saw disorder. Mexico saw survival. French merchants saw their livelihoods harassed by riots, loans, and restrictions. Mexican officials saw foreigners demanding privileges in a country where ordinary Mexicans had no such protections. This is how a conflict becomes poisonous, not because one side has no argument, but because both sides speak from pain and neither side trusts the other's wound. The ledgers told their own story. French exports to Mexico had once seemed promising, reaching 18.3 million francs in 1830. By 1835, they had fallen to 7.5 million. In 1838, with the blockade tightening, they dropped even lower, but Mexico was still a tiny part of France's wider trade, and the French colony itself was probably no more than a few thousand souls. This was not France fighting for survival. This was France fighting for pride, and pride had a name in Mexico: Baron Antoine de Foix, the French minister. Years of failed negotiation had worn him down. He believed Mexico needed a severe lesson, the kind delivered not with parchment but with iron. In his mind, the problem was simple: send ships, blockade the Gulf, threaten Veracruz, take San Juan de Ulúa if necessary. Mexico, poor and divided, would understand the message and bow. This was the dangerous fantasy of gunboat diplomacy. From a desk in Paris, the map looked obedient. The coast was a line, Veracruz was a dot, the fortress was a target. But maps lie by omission. They do not show fever in the blood, bad water in the barrels, storms in the Gulf, soldiers refusing to be frightened, or a country whose poverty made it strangely difficult to squeeze. France thought Mexico could be punished from the sea. Mexico would teach France that a coastline is not a nation. France did not plan a conquest of the interior. That part must be clear. In 1838, this was not yet the dream of placing a European prince on a Mexican throne. That nightmare would come decades later, under Napoleon III. King Louis Philippe's government wanted pressure, payment, commercial guarantees, and prestige. When the first French ships appeared, they carried cannons, sailors, and confidence. They did not carry an invasion army to Mexico City. In April of 1838, France broke off relations. It began exerting pressure, culminating in a blockade of Mexico's Gulf ports. The French hoped the sight of warships would do most of the work, but Mexico did not fold. Bustamante's government refused to negotiate under humiliation. The French squadron found itself waiting offshore, surrounded not by surrender, but by distance, heat, storms, logistics, and the miserable truth that intimidation is easier to announce than to maintain. The first French effort was almost cursed from the beginning. The ships arrived late, repairs take time, supplies scattered. Even drinking water had to be hauled from places like Havana or New Orleans. Then came the coast's most feared visitor, black vomit fever. Summer settled on the Gulf like a wet cloth over the mouth. Sailors began to fall ill. By August, nearly half the crews were sick or dying. The tropics were teaching back the lesson France had come to teach. Defoe, whose confidence had helped bring the fleet, broke in health and spirit and returned to France. The commander, Post Captain Bazoche, had to admit the expedition was failing. Imagine the shame of it. France had come to discipline a young republic. Instead, it floated in fever, unable to force a clean victory, unable to retreat without looking foolish. But governments often fear embarrassment more than expense, so Paris chose a second blow. This time, Rear Admiral Charles Baudin arrived, a harder figure with a larger force. By most counts, more than 20 vessels gathered under French command, including frigates, mortar ships, and steamers. Now the performance has changed. The blockade tightened. The old fortress of San Juan de Ulúa, standing on its reef off Veracruz like a stone animal guarding the harbor, became the center of the storm. San Juan de Ulúa had seen centuries of empire pass over the Gulf. Spanish ships, silver dreams, prisoners, soldiers, storms. Its walls carried the memory of New Spain and the arrogance of old stone. To attack it was not only to attack a fort, it was to strike the face of Veracruz, the face of customs, the face of Mexico's access to the sea. And on November 27, 1838, the French opened fire. The bombardment was brutal and modern. Shells burst against walls that had been built for another age of war. Smoke rolled over the water. Stone shook. Guns answered from the fortress, but the balance was cruel. By the next day, San Juan de Ulúa had been forced into surrender. To French eyes, this looked like vindication. To Mexican eyes, it looked like outrage. The old fortress had fallen, but Mexico's anger had only awakened. By the last days of November, Mexico moved into open war against France. A law of expulsion followed in early December, aimed at French subjects in the Republic. This was no small thing. Suddenly, the people France claimed to protect became exposed to the fury created by France's own intervention. In Mexico City, Veracruz, and other places, French residents faced the possibility of leaving homes, tools, shops, and lives behind under pressure from the state and the crowd. And here comes Santa Anna, limping into the story before he is even wounded. Antonio López de Santa Anna had already lived many political lives. He had been president, general, opportunist, survivor, and for many Mexicans, the man stained by the disaster of Texas. After San Jacinto, his glory had cracked, but history sometimes opens a door in the smoke, and Santa Anna knew how to step through the smoke better than almost anyone in Mexico. He was called to defend Veracruz. The French, worried about Mexican batteries and hoping to neutralize resistance, sent landing parties into the city. Their goals were practical: silence guns, strike quickly, perhaps capture Santa Anna or other commanders, and return to the ships. It was not meant to become a legend, but legends are born when intention fails. The French moved through the port under dawn's gray breath, and the city became a maze of echoes. The raid partly succeeded. French forces silenced positions and captured General Mariano Arista, but Santa Anna slipped away. Then, as the French prepared to re-embark, he gathered men and pressed forward. The fight was brief, confused, and later dressed in more glory than it probably wore in the moment. Still, one blast changed everything. French fire struck Santa Anna, mangling his leg and killing or injuring the horse beneath him. On December 5, 1838, his body became a political battlefield. His leg was amputated. But Santa Anna did what Santa Anna always did. He turned disaster into theater. A less gifted politician loses a limb and is pitied. Santa Anna lost a limb and wrapped it in national symbolism. He had faced the French. He had bled at Veracruz. He had, in his telling, driven invaders back to the sea. The facts were messier than the monument. But nations in pain do not always ask monuments for footnotes. His severed leg was later given ceremonial burial under an imposing monument, and Congress honored him with a magnificent diamond cross. Imagine that image. A republic too poor to steady its treasury, yet rich enough in symbolism to bury a general's leg like a relic. The leg became proof, not of a clean military victory, but of something Mexico desperately needed: the feeling that a foreign power could wound the body and still fail to conquer the spirit. Bourdin understood what the theater tried to hide. France had taken the fortress. France had hurt Veracruz. France could continue the blockade, but France had not solved the problem. To march inland and truly force Mexico would require an army of tens of thousands, and that meant a different war entirely. Mexico's mountains, distance, poverty, and stubborn political fractures formed a shell. A fleet could hammer the outside for months and still not touch the heart. That is the secret of this war. France was strong enough to strike Mexico, but not prepared to remake it. Mexico was too weak to defeat France at sea, but too large, broken, and difficult to be disciplined by a blockade alone. The French could squeeze the customs throat, but the body kept twitching. Bourdin could punish. He could not govern. He could burn pride into the harbor. He could not turn pride into policy. The blockade became a two-edged blade. It deprived Mexico of customs revenue. But it also strangled the French commerce it was supposed to protect. French merchants suffered. Mexican merchants suffered. Sailors suffered. The treasury suffered. People experiencing poverty, as always, paid for decisions made by men who spoke of honor from safer rooms. At least hundreds of French sailors died, most not from heroic battle, but from fever. The Gulf kept its own casualty list. By March of 1839, everyone needed a doorway out. Britain provided one. British interest did not arrive as pure kindness. Trade hates a blocked port, but British mediation gave both sides a way to step back without fully admitting failure. The key figure was Richard Pakenham, the British minister connected to the negotiations. On March 9, 1839, a treaty ended the conflict. France would lift the blockade and return San Juan de Ulúa. Mexico agreed to pay 600,000 pesos. Those pesos were the famous number, the one that makes the story sound like a pastry bill written by a madman. But they were not only for remontel. They covered a collection of French claims, swollen by diplomacy and sharpened by pride. Some older English writing calls them Mexican dollars, but for our ears, pesos is clearer. Silver coins, national debt, foreign pressure, and the price of being weak in a world ruled by ships. So did France win? On paper, yes. It took the fortress. It forced payment. It sailed away with a treaty. But paper is often the most obedient witness. It signs whatever the powerful need it to sign. The deeper French goals were less secure. The colony still lacked the kind of durable protection France had wanted. The questions of forced loans, retail trade, future claims, and real commercial stability remained cloudy, vulnerable, and ready to return like a fever. Did Mexico win? In spirit, many Mexicans said yes. The ships left, the Republic survived. Santa Anna rose from the smoke, wrapped in patriotic injury. The story became a David and Goliath tale, standing up to an arrogant European power. But that mirror was flattering too. Mexico had been financially damaged, its main port humiliated, its people pressured, and its government pushed deeper into the same desperation that caused the conflict in the first place. Both nations walked away wearing costumes. France dressed retreat as generosity, Mexico dressed survival as triumph. And the French residents in Mexico, the supposed reason for all of it, often found themselves worse off than before. Some had been forced out, some sold belongings in panic, and some returned months later to damaged livelihoods. They were the people caught between flag and flag, useful in speeches, fragile in real life. This is why the Pastry War is so easy to misunderstand. It was not a grand war of conquest, but it was not a silly quarrel over dessert either. It was the first French intervention in Mexico, a rehearsal in miniature for bigger tragedies. France learned that ships alone could not bend Mexico. Mexico learned that foreign pressure could become fire. And both sides learned the wrong lesson just well enough to suffer from it later. Within a decade, Franco-Mexican relations would again sour in familiar ways. Claims, debts, accusations wounded dignity. The old wheel kept turning. And decades later, under Napoleon III, France would return with a far darker dream, not merely to blockade a port, but to invade the interior and place Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian on a Mexican throne. The Pastry War did not cause that tragedy alone, but it left a footprint on the road. There is something almost prophetic in the image of San Juan de Ulúa, a fortress on a reef, battered by modern shells, standing between Mexico and the sea. It had been built to guard an empire. Now it watched a republic struggle with the same geography, the same hunger for revenue, the same foreign ships measuring the coast. The stone changed owners. The logic did not. Whoever controls the port touches the throat of the country. And something is haunting in Raimondo's pastry shop, too. A small place, maybe ordinary, maybe damaged in a riot like so many other places in those unstable years. Yet that small shop became the name of a war. Not because pastries moved fleets, but because stories need objects. A cake is easier to remember than a tariff schedule. A broken bakery is easier to picture than diplomatic clauses. The symbol survived because it was ridiculous enough to be immortal. But we should be careful with ridicule. Laugh too hard at the pastry, and we miss the people. The shopkeeper whose loss became a weapon. The Mexican workers who never chose the conflict but endured its prices. The sailors are coughing blood in the Gulf heat. The officials are trying to run a bankrupt country with empty hands. The civilians of Veracruz are watching foreign shells fall near the city. The French residents were ordered to leave a country where many had made their home. History often begins with something small enough to dismiss. A shop, a debt, a refused meeting, a clause nobody wants to ratify, a government too poor to be graceful. Then the small thing grows teeth. It becomes an ultimatum, then a blockade, then a bombardment, then a monument over a buried leg. And years later, people ask how sweetness turned into smoke. The truth is that sweetness did not turn into smoke. Power did, pride did, poverty did. The pastry was only the crumb history left on the table, so later generations could find their way back into the room. And once we enter that room, we see the real feast: commerce, nationalism, resentment, wounded masculinity, imperial pressure, and a young republic trying to defend its dignity with a treasury that barely breathed. So no, France did not really go to war over pastries. France went to war because it believed Mexico could be frightened into order. Mexico resisted because surrender would have felt like accepting the old colonial script with new actors. France won the fortress and lost the larger lesson. Mexico lost the fortress and gained a legend. Santa Anna lost a leg and found a pathway back to power. Everyone claimed meaning. Nobody truly solved the wound. And that is why the Pastry War still matters. Not because it was absurd, but because absurd names can hide serious violence. Not because it was the biggest war, but because small wars often reveal the machinery of bigger ones. A pastry shop gave the conflict its nickname. Veracruz gave it smoke. San Juan de Ulúa gave it stone. Santa Anna's leg gave it myth, and the treaty gave it an ending that was not really an ending. The sea carried the French ships away, but it did not carry away the problem. The port reopened. The merchants returned. The diplomats sharpened new complaints. Mexico remained poor, proud, divided, and watched. France remained ambitious, wounded by its own vanity, and tempted by the idea that Latin American nations could be corrected from abroad. The pastry shop faded. The pattern stayed. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.